What's up, guys? This is Chris McCormick, and in this video I want to show you what has quickly become one of my favorite machine learning tools, and it's called Google Colaboratory, or Colab for short. Colab is a completely free environment for creating and running and sharing Python notebooks. So it's also very easy to try out. All you need is a Google account and you're ready to go. And when I say that it's free, I don't just mean like a time trial or some number of free credits. It's completely free. You can use it as much as you want. I kind of think of it like Google gives us free Gmail and Google Docs and Google Sheets, and now they're giving us a free Python development environment to work in. Pretty cool. So a big part of why Colab is so amazing is actually the project that it's built on top of, which is Jupyter Notebooks. And if you're not familiar with notebooks, that's okay. I was actually a pretty late adopter to notebooks myself. I started my career developing Java and C in environments like Eclipse. And then when I switched to machine learning in around like 2012, I actually started in MATLAB using that development environment, and then Spider, which is kind of like the Python equivalent. So the jump from there to notebooks is pretty big. But if you're a data scientist or something in that field, then I highly recommend you learn notebooks and add that to your tool set. Notebooks aren't a replacement for those other kinds of development environments. They have a kind of a more specific purpose. They're really great for developing algorithms, running experiments, and then especially for sharing and explaining the code or the results. And that makes them an especially great tool for someone like myself who likes to explain stuff a lot. So I will go through some of the basics of how to work with notebooks, but before I do that, let's take a look at some of the things that are unique to Google Colab in particular. So to work in a notebook, you can either click the link of a notebook that somebody shared with you, or you can just go to the Colab website. It's at colab.research.google.com. And just click New Notebook. And right away, you're given this development environment where you can start running Python code. And the code is not running on my local machine. This is running on a Google instance that they're providing for me. The Colab instance isn't quite as powerful as my desktop. I think they only give you maybe a couple cores, but they do give you a decent amount of RAM. There's about 12 gigabytes of RAM there. And really, I think the best part is that it comes pre-configured with any kind of computer vision or machine learning or natural language processing package that you might want is probably already installed here. So it comes with TensorFlow, obviously, but it also comes with PyTorch, NumPy, obviously, scikit-learn, GenSim is one I like. So they're all there. And if there's something that you need that's not there, you can access the Linux command line by starting your line with a exclamation point. And then I can do pip install and install whatever I need there. But it's already got everything I need. I think that's really valuable because it completely removes that setup hurdle. I feel like so many times I've tried to run someone else's example code and I spend a lot of time just getting the right dependencies installed and my environment set up correctly. So getting rid of that is really nice. And then I think some of you will appreciate, I use primarily Windows, and I'll use Linux if I need to. But every now and then I'll run into a package that doesn't compile on Windows, and so I've got to switch to a Linux VM or something like that. So this removes that as well because you're running on a Linux instance here. And the last thing I'll point out is that Colab has a number of bells and whistles that are enabled by default. I think you can get these in Jupyter Notebook too, but it's nice just having them there by default. So for every cell, you can kind of hover your mouse and see how long it took to execute. And then there's also this nice outline view. There we go. So on the sidebar here, there's a table of contents, and if it's hidden, you'll see this kind of pull-out arrow here. And you can move around the notebook to different sections that way. You can even collapse the sections, which makes a lot of sense. So you can hide different portions of the notebook. Next, if you are in fact new to the notebook environment, then I want to show you some of the basics. The notebook interface can be kind of frustrating if you're not given some good initial guidance on how to use it well. If you're already really familiar with notebooks, then you can skip over that section. I'll make sure to put the timestamp down in the video description. And the last thing I'll cover in this video is probably the most significant caveat to using Google Colab. And that's that because you're running on a remote instance, the Colab Notebook instance doesn't have direct, easy access to your local file system. So managing your files becomes something that you have to be concerned with. They do give you access to the instance's local file system, and then they do have some nice features for interfacing with your Google Drive, so you can use your drive as persistent storage, but I'll cover that at the end. So if you type in colab.research.google.com, it'll take you to this welcome page for Colaboratory. So there's some nice getting started content on this page that you can come back to later. Right now we're going to create a new Python 3 notebook. And this gives us a blank notebook to play around in. I'm going to hit F11 and go to full screen. So this notebook is stored on your Google Drive, and whatever we run in it is actually going to run on Google's cloud. So you probably already have a free personal Google account that maybe you use for Gmail or Google Drive or maybe even Google Docs. So you can think of Colab as yet another cloud-based product from Google that's free to use. In this case, it's a product that lets you develop and run Python code in an environment that's really geared towards data science in particular. If you're familiar with Jupyter Notebooks, you'll recognize right away that Colab is really just Jupyter with some additional features. So Jupyter works with this concept of cells. There are code cells and there are text cells. And these are really just blocks of text and blocks of code. So I'm going to add a new text cell, and I can add formatted text using markdown. So I can use a # to add a heading. I can just type in plain text that's unformatted. I can add bulleted lists. And then you can even add links, link to Colab. Or even images. So it previews off to the side here, and then when I add a new cell, it will render. So I can add a code cell below now. And there's the formatted text that we just created, and here's our new code cell. So let's do the customary hello world. To run code, you can hit this little play button off to the side. And we see the output added. Let's do something a little more interesting. So we can import NumPy. And create a random matrix. 4 rows, 5 columns. So a really handy feature here is that you can do tab completion. So if I start to type in NumPy random, hit tab, it brings in all the options. And then I hit tab again to pick one. And I can do the same for rand. Hit tab again. And then once you put the parentheses in, you can actually hit tab and it will pull up the doc string for that function. So you can also modify and rerun cells or groups of cells. So you can execute things out of order and go back and fix things if you want. So I can add some exclamation points, rerun that guy. So that's really valuable if you made a mistake or want to change something, but you don't want to rerun the entire experiment. So this whole concept of cells allows you to intersperse code cells and documentation or explanations and illustrations, as well as the output from your code. So if you were a software developer and you were working on, a software application or software library, this environment wouldn't make a lot of sense for you. It's really geared towards conducting experiments and being able to share and communicate the results of those experiments. And obviously that's something we do a lot in data science and machine learning. Now I want to share an insight with you that honestly took me an embarrassingly long time to figure out myself. I really want to save you from the same mistake. So far you've seen me use my mouse to click on these code and text buttons to add cells, right? And then to click on these play buttons to run the cells. So that's fine for when you're just getting started with Colab, but pretty soon that's going to drive you nuts because you're constantly entering code or entering text, and then you got to switch from the keyboard back to your mouse so you can add another cell. So if you're going to use notebooks and actually enjoy working in them, which I really hope you do, you've got to learn a few of the basic keyboard shortcuts so that you're not going back to the mouse so often. So just as you might expect, there are shortcuts for everything, and you can learn as few of them or as many of them as you want. But I'm going to give you the handful that I think are just musts for working with notebooks. So first of all, here's how you avoid ever having to come hit these text and code insert buttons again. So I'm going to paste these shortcuts in here so you can see them, and then I'll talk through them. So you'll notice that they all start by holding Control and M together, followed by pressing a specific letter that corresponds to the command. If you're on a Mac, then as usual, you replace the Control key with the Command key. So all of these just become Command M instead of Control M. So to insert a new cell, it's Control M-A for above or Control M-B for below. So let's add a new one below, Control M-B. There we go. And then I can type some code in. And then I can do a cell above if I want. So whenever you insert a cell, it's going to be added as a code cell. So to change the cell type, you can use these two commands. The one you'll most likely need to use, since it always inserts a code cell, is Control M to make it text. And the M stands for markdown in this case. Okay, so that's how you add cells. Now you can add code or text cells without having to click those buttons. The most common command that you're probably going to be using is to run the current cell, and you want to be able to do that without having to come click this play button all the time. So here are the two main shortcuts for running a cell. The first one, Alt-Enter, will run the current cell and insert a new one. And I think that's what you're going to want the most often. The other option is Control-Enter, which runs the current cell but then leaves your cursor in it. So this is useful for when you know that you're writing throwaway code. You're maybe playing with something or inspecting an object, and you know that you're going to want to delete it or change it immediately after you've run it. The last essential keyboard shortcut is to delete a cell. So I can select a previous cell that we ran and hit Control-MD, and that gets rid of it. So that's it for the keyboard shortcuts that I wanted to show you. I think if you can at least learn those, that's going to go a long way in improving your overall experience with Colab. And like I said earlier, there's plenty more shortcuts to learn, and you can actually find them all under the Tools menu under Keyboard Shortcuts, which of course has its own shortcut, Control-MH. So if you open that up, you can see that there's a pretty long list here. Most of them haven't actually been set, but you can see the ones that have. And it might be interesting to come back here at some point later to see what other things you might like to use a shortcut for. The last thing I want to talk about with Colab is how we work with files and how that file system works. So because your notebook is going to be running on a remote instance or remote virtual machine, that instance doesn't have direct access to your local hard drive, to your file system. So let's talk about how we handle files in Colab. Files with Colab. So first of all, the instance does have a file system, and you do have access to that. And along with that, Colab does make it easy to upload and download files. And you can also avoid all of those file transfers by mounting your Google Drive directly to the instance. And then you can use your drive to store your work. First off, your notebook is running on a Linux instance, and you have access to the Linux file system underneath. So over here on the left margin of the window, there's this expansion arrow. And if you click it, it brings out this sidebar. And there's actually a files section. And this is showing you the contents of the current working directory for the instance. So we can actually use the OS package to check our current working directory. So they stick you in a folder called /content. We can also write a quick text file. I'm just going to copy in some code for that. So we just wrote a file called testing.txt and threw some text in it. And now if I look over here, looks like I need to hit refresh, but there it is, shows up. So you can see that they also preload the instances with this sample data folder. We got some files in there. And then down at the bottom here, they show you your current disk usage. So apparently you get an instance with about 50 gigabytes, of which maybe half of that is actually available to you. And they also show that information up here. They show you that they give you between 12 and 13 gigabytes and 50 gigabytes of storage. So there are some limits here to what Google's giving you for free, but it seems pretty generous. Another nice feature is that you have the ability to upload and download files pretty easily. So one way to do that is just using the GUI. If you right-click on a file, then you can download it. If you right-click on a folder, you can select Upload to upload a file from your machine. But of course, you can also do this with code. So Colab has this example notebook that shows you a lot about working with files in Colab. And here are some code snippets for uploading and downloading files using Python code. So they have their own package here that includes this files class that lets you upload and download files pretty simply. So you can see it downloaded. We wrote example.txt and then I downloaded it to my downloads folder. Pretty straightforward. So another nice option is that you can use your Google Drive as your file system. So that gives you some persistent storage and you avoid all the network overhead. So they make this pretty simple. Again, using Google's own Colab package, they've created this class called Drive. And this will mount your Google Drive to a folder here called G Drive. And when I run this, there's an authorization step. So it gives you a URL. You click the URL. It takes you to a login page. You sign in. You have to grant access to Colab. And then they give you this long string code that you can copy and paste back into this little form here. Hit enter. And this takes a little while apparently. But once it mounts successfully, you end up with this G drive folder. So again, I'll hit refresh here. And now you can see there's my entire G drive directory structure is here. So an important aspect of all of this is that you should think of the Colab instance's storage as temporary. So whatever files you store over here are not guaranteed to be there the next time you open your notebook. So for example, if I left this notebook open at the end of the day, intending to come back to it the next day to work on it, at some point during the evening, Google's going to recognize that the notebook is idle, and they're going to disconnect me from the instance. So just be sure that any result files that you want to keep from the experiments that you run, that you're either storing those in Google Drive or that you're downloading them so that you don't lose them.